Word.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. Today on the show, we have Dr. Joel Cuello from the University of Arizona. Dr. Cuello, you're a professor of agriculture and biosystems engineering. He's a director of Global Initiative for Strategic Agriculture and Dry Lands for the U of A here in Tucson. He's designed many systems in the fields, including hydroponics, tissue culture, industrial mass production of algae, and I don't want to screw this one up, the bioregenerative space life support, which that must have been at your time at NASA where you did your postdoctoral research. So thank you for being here, Dr. Cuello. We're excited to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you, Camden. Thank you, Otis. And I'm glad to be on the show.
Yeah, Joel, this is exciting. And I tell you what, I'd like to say I planned this out so well because, and I didn't. But last night I was in Denver at Techstars Sustainable Accelerator demo, and they have a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, and it was just an unbelievable show with eight startup companies, and then now we're having this recording this podcast with you and your focus is on the sustainability. So I'm just feeling like I need to go out and do some extra recycling right now.
And that's wonderful.
Yeah, I learned a lot last night, and I'm looking forward to talking with you and learning some more about how you come up with these ideas, and the innovation, I think, is my favorite thing. Oh man, I just drew a blank on the quote, but the mother of innovation. Problems are the mother of innovation, or there's that old quote.
And necessity is the mother of invention.
There we go, necessity.
Yes.
Thank you. But so I'm just wondering, how does that come about? Because the list of things that you've been involved with, which is awesome. How do you find those? I was going to say fall into, but I'm sure there's a forward thought to it.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of thought involved in it, and of course there's a process as well. But for me, and I'm sure that this is true as well for a lot of people, is we start with a big picture, and we start with the challenge at hand. And that's what's really inspiring people to be creative and to be inventive and to be innovative. So just as that famous phrase is, necessity is the mother of invention. So when we're faced with a critical need or a critical necessity, which constitutes as a challenge or a grand challenge, then that really provokes people and incites people to be creative and to be innovative. So to me, in terms of at least my process of being creative and innovative and inventive, that's how it begins. It always starts with the big picture or the big challenge. So in this case, in my case, it would be sustainability. Sustainability is a big picture topic that has an impact on a planetary level. It impacts everyone on the planet today. And then, of course, it drives a lot of specific areas. So that's the big picture that I always refer to, and that always informs my creativity and my innovation, and that always drives it.
Do me a favor and give me your definition of sustainability.
Right. Well, there's this formal definition of sustainability. I think that was formulated by the United Nations or some sort of a global organization, that it's the approach or the strategy of being able to use resources today in a way that there will be resources left for future generations. And it's interesting that there's actually a group or a tribe of American Indians who a long time ago, this is hundreds of years ago, they formulated their own, shall we say, a principle about sustainability. And that is, when they use a resource today, they have to do it in such a way that there will be resources left for their next 7 generations. Mm-hmm. And that was really inspiring. But in essence, that's what sustainability is. You utilize your resources today, be it water, be it land, be it energy, in such a way that there will be enough left that would be sufficient for the incoming generations.
So I like that, and I appreciate you doing that, because it's not the zero sum, or the you know,
Right.
everything we use has to be reused and reused and reused. I like that it's a sustainable, and there I am using the word to define the word, but you're
Right.
leaving some of it behind for future
Yes.
generations, for them to figure out how to use it, and further make efficiencies. I think that's probably for me, because I always focus on efficiencies in the business.
Right, that is correct. Yeah, yeah. And as you know, it becomes really critical today, and it really has manifested itself in terms of the critical need for sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
because one is our global population. We're now at about 7.5 billion, and by 2050, it is expected that we will be adding another China, another India to our current population. So that would be about 9.5 billion people. So that's a lot of people. And all of this, every one of them will be consuming, will be eating, will be using energy. And so the big question is, do we have enough water? Do we have enough energy? Do we have enough raw materials to be able to sustain everyone's way of life in the middle of the century?
And I think this is interesting because, that already ties back into the first thing we were talking about. Necessity is the mother of innovation, right? And if we're looking at the situation as it gets worse and worse, it's one of those things. And I know I'm younger, so I view this in a warped lens, but it was almost a like, there's not money in that. Once there's money in it, then things will start happening. And the worse the situation gets, the more money goes into it. That's the simple idea flow right there. If you have money behind you, you can do a lot more and be a lot more effective. And you're starting to see that shift a lot now as it becomes more of a necessity to put the money in that area.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And I just wanted to connect that back to a story I've heard a while back. And I think I might have told this to you a while ago, Dr. Cuello, of looking back at the invention of the automobile, and how when the car was first invented, it was hailed as the green solution because horse manure was piling up in the streets. And if
Right.
we can just take our lens, our mental lens, and look back from then and look where we are now, think, whatever the flying car that runs on solar or whatever it is, it's probably around the corner. We'll figure this one out too. But I always just think that's a funny way of putting it in perspective over the lifetime of, humanity, really.
Correct. Correct. Yes. Yeah. And it's the same thing with food. Malthus. He was the one who put forward the Malthusian theory of population, that over time people will run out of food, and therefore the human population will drop precipitously. But that has never happened, actually. And that is because we humans found innovative ways, innovative solutions for multiplying our food supply. And so we've never really run out of food, on a planetary scale.
Right.
And that is why his prediction has never happened. And so that's the power of innovation. That's the power of creativity.
Well, I'd like to go from there as we're talking about innovation inside agriculture, and I think one of the most interesting things I wanted to talk to you about is your time at NASA for your postdoctoral research. Because what's more creative than space, right? As far as most of us are concerned, that's the most creative opportunity any of us could have in front of us, really.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So as you were going through your time there, so could you walk me through your time there a little bit? I know you worked on the vertical farms and the life support systems, and I know you've taken me through a little bit of that process, but if you could go back through that for Otis and for all the listeners here.
Right. So it began during my years as a grad student at Penn State. I did my master's in agricultural engineering, and also my PhD in agricultural and biological engineering at Penn State, or the Pennsylvania State University. And I was working then on micropropagation, controlled environment systems for micropropagation for my master's, meaning to say I was controlling the temperature, I was controlling the light, and the nutritional factors that govern the multiplication of plants in a closed container, like a test tube, for instance. And then in my PhD, I pursued my research work on design of bioreactors. So bioreactor is a fancy terminology for a container or a vessel where you control certain environmental parameters or factors so that you can maximize the growth and production of whatever you're growing inside. And in this case, we were growing plant cells and plant roots that produce pharmaceutical compounds. So when I was in grad school, of course, I presented this at national or international conferences, and that's where I met my future mentor. His name is John Sager. He was a scientist, an engineer at NASA Kennedy Space Center at that time. And so he attended one of my presentations, and I believe that was on controlled environment micropropagation. And he gravitated toward it because that was of direct relevance to what they were doing at NASA at that time. And that division at NASA is called Controlled Ecological Life Support Systems, or the acronym is CELL, CELSS. And what it was about is basically space farming. And so that's how it began. We maintained our link, and he was mentoring me, and he made a suggestion that after I finished my PhD, perhaps I could do my postdoctoral fellowship at NASA Kennedy. And so he helped me apply for a fellowship. This is through the United States National Research Council. And fortunately, I got that fellowship. And so after I graduated from Penn State for my PhD, I went directly to NASA Kennedy. And that's where I enjoyed that, the ability and that opportunity to work for space farming, so to speak.
So as we talked about with necessity and, kind of working from the needed solution backwards, is the best way to put it. Is that what your process was a lot like at NASA? Was it, okay, as a human, we need this much food over this period of time, and we have to grow, and figuring out how to grow and produce that much nutrients for the astronauts? Or was there a different process there? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a perfect illustration of, that phrase that necessity is the mother of invention, because the challenge is we have to be able to provide food for astronauts on long duration space missions. So these are astronauts that are intended to stay on the surface of the moon or on the surface of Mars for extended periods of time. So for instance, for Mars, for the mission to be feasible, the astronauts will have to stay there for 2 years on the surface. And it would take them 6 months. That's the shortest path, is for 6 months to travel from the Earth to Mars, and then to return is also 6 months. So that's a total of 6 years minimum. And therefore, it's not possible for the astronauts to carry with them all of the resources that they will need in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of water, and other resources. So they will have to be able to grow and regenerate resources on the surface of Mars. There's no other choice. And that is, of course, true as well for food. They have to find ways to be able to grow food on site, on the surface of Mars. So that was the grand challenge. That was the necessity. And so that's what prompted the creative and innovative solutions on how to go about addressing that particular challenge. And the answer, of course, is what we refer to as controlled environment agriculture. So you're growing crops in a totally sealed and totally enclosed environment where you control the temperature, you control the relative humidity, you control the light in terms of intensity, in terms of colors, in terms of duration per day, and you control the nutrients that are in the liquid that is being used for watering and irrigating the plants. And then also the configuration, the physical configuration and geometry of the growing structure wherein you're growing the plants. All of those are extremely critical because you got to come up with a system that is lightweight, and pretty small, so that its deployment from the Earth to space would be feasible. So again, that's a perfect illustration of that necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you know, in tying it back into a planning sense, and the way my mind works with planning, it is what's the outcome you want. And I thought that was really interesting. I mean, for a highly complicated solution, I mean, it truly became a complicated solution, but the outcome was give people in space something to eat and survive on.
Mm-hmm.
And then you walk back for that, and then this blossoming, I mean, really this blossoming industry of how you can grow things in controlled environments and create efficiencies through that controlled environment. And how do you tweak, you know, the
Right.
water, the chemical additives or whatever organic matter additives in your water, so that you get more efficiencies in your plants, so that you can use the lights in a different way, and all of these sort of things. And
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's one of the very interesting things. Like we were talking about how, you know, the economic power behind things. If there's money behind something, you get that much more innovation because the money fuels, you know, people got to get paid so they can live their lives while they're not inventing, right? And then what you see though is this interesting curve where there's all these research opportunities years and years and years ago, and now it's a business opportunity for me, you know, a generation later, to where the efficiencies have gone so far over the course of the last 30 years that it is now economically feasible for a business to do this, not just with $1 million of grants, right? And you kind of see that curve as things go. You know, you get the money behind it, and then you start driving that price down. It's one of the interesting things I've talked about before with controlled environment agriculture, that with the cannabis boom, the green boom here in the U.S. and up in Colorado, how that has led to such a dramatic price decrease that it increased the efficiencies of regular agriculture, because all of a sudden they needed these fancier lights. So the slightly less fancy lights were way cheaper, and then normal agriculture, you know, normal farmers could be buying those lights. And so you kind of see that economic cycle of the invention in the more long term, I think.
Right. You're both absolutely right. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So because of the research that was being conducted by NASA on space farming, and I have to say, it's the same thing with the Soviet Union during that time. So the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR, they had their own space program, and they had their own space farming unit as well, or controlled ecological life support systems. So these two were doing research in parallel. But a direct offshoot, I would say, of NASA's efforts on space farming translated into Earth applications, and particularly in Japan, where vertical farming really first emerged, even though they didn't refer to that as vertical farming, but rather plant factory, but it's the same thing. So it really first emerged commercially in Japan, particularly in Tokyo, in 30 years ago or so. And even now, you know, it's still thriving in Japan. So their idea for the plant factory is they had this warehouse, and inside the warehouse is completely sealed and closed. Inside the warehouse, they have these shelves that are stacked one on top of another, so that it's several stories high. And they were growing their crops that are grown hydroponically. And they're not using sunlight, but they're using artificial lighting, which later became mostly light-emitting diodes. And they're controlling the environmental parameters, temperature, relative humidity, and so on and so forth. So they found a way practically of growing crops on Earth at the maximum yield and productivity, maximum quality, and they're not using any pesticides because it's a clean operation. And they're able to grow these 24/7, 365 days a year. So that was revolutionary in itself, because essentially they decoupled the process of growing crops and food from geography and from climate. So this is a wonderful thing.
And I think just to touch back to one of our main points as we've been going through this, and as the U.S. and the USSR were in the space race, we had the necessity to provide food for the long-term missions and outer space. Japan had the other problem of they don't have that much land, and they got a big country full of a lot of people. You know, when it comes down to it, if you don't have land to grow food, where are you going to grow that food? And we're seeing that now in a lot of U.S. cities. You know, the rooftop gardens that are going up in New York and those type of things. When you run out of land and land gets so expensive, you got to get creative, right?
Correct. Yes, that's absolutely correct. So again, there's the grand challenge of sustainability in space and how to address that. And NASA and the Soviet Union, they came up with this, conceptual solution on how to do that. And then that was basically borrowed or stolen in terms of the concept and the idea, and basically spun that off and translated that onto commercial application in Japan. Which really addresses their sustainability challenges as well as food insecurity. Because as you mentioned, they have very limited fertile land. And now, of course, vertical farming is spreading everywhere on Earth. And again, it's addressing directly sustainability challenges, not only in terms of land, but also in terms of water, because with vertical farming using hydroponics and aeroponics, you can serve as much as 80 to 95% of water compared with open field cultivation. And fresh water is a huge issue worldwide today in terms of its availability and people's access to it. So, being able to produce food with limited land and with a lot of savings on fresh water, that is a wonderful thing.
I'm curious, was there collaboration with the Soviet Union, or was it more of a competition?
It was both. So they were, I guess the US and USSR were frenemies in that regard. So on a scientific level, of course, they presented at certain scientific meetings and conferences. And, there was informal conversation among scientists. But of course, at that time, it was never made a formal cooperation.
Right. Right. You can't admit that kind of stuff in public, right? As a politician.
That's yes.
Back then, definitely.
Right.
Well, I think that touches on something else interesting that I've read about many times, that going back to the Cold War and agriculture, so much of the U.S. agricultural industry as we know it now is pretty much built on the Cold War, because what's again, necessity's driving invention. The limiting factor during that time is our population growth. And as we're expending all this money and all this energy towards, the Cold War against USSR, it was who can keep feeding their country while we're doing all this? Can you keep spending that money and not run out of crops in the ground? And so our industrial agriculture really came from that era. The supermarkets wind up coming from that era because it was hey, look what capitalism can do. Look what a free market can do. Now we have this giant, amazing grocery store that has everything you could possibly need in it. And then the agricultural industry built out from there. And it's just one of those lasting effect type things, just like the vertical farming, just agriculture industry as a whole, and the decentralized farming that we have now.
Right.
I'm curious.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead, Joel. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I was disagreeing with Camden.
Good. Let's hear it. Oh, you were agreeing or disagreeing?
Agreeing.
Oh.
We're going to say some disagreement's always good. That's good conversation.
But Otis, go ahead, please. Go ahead, Otis.
Well, I'm curious, Joel. So you have this, you've done a lot of amazing research, and you continue to do that. But yet you work with our young minds every day, and which, is got to be a challenge and a privilege all into its own. And I'm curious how this desire to innovate and find solutions that don't exist, how you're instilling that with your students.
Right. Yes, that's a very good question. I don't think that I have a methodical way of doing it, but being in the presence of young minds in itself kind of triggers, I suppose, that exchange between them and me in terms of cultivating creativity. So the way I define creativity is that it's the capacity for the process of creating. And that involves intellect, of course, as well as inspiration. And to me, inspiration here is directly tied to that grand challenge that we were talking about earlier. There has to be a grand challenge such as sustainability or food security that would inspire us to use our intellect to come up with some innovative processes. And so that's the process of creativity. And it's a culture as well. And so when I'm with my students, be it grad students or undergrad students, whenever I have the opportunity, I really make an effort to make them aware, first of all, that there is such a culture, which is the culture of innovation, the culture of value creation, the culture of creativity and invention, and that this is directly tied to the grand challenge of whatever it is. But in my case, of course, it's sustainability and food security. And that these young people, being in college, being in grad school, they really are in these commanding heights, so to speak, where they are well positioned to come up with these innovative solutions to address these grand challenges. So that's the general approach, or the general way by which I impart creativity to them. Then, of course, it becomes more detailed as we address technical challenges and come up with more technical solutions or specific solutions to those grand challenges.
Well, one thing I'd like to touch on there, because I just saw this great similarity between listening to you, Dad, talk about coaching and all these other people who work with entrepreneurs. And that's all you hear is you want to be with entrepreneurs because they have the fire, they have the passion. Those are the best people you want to be coaching. And I almost hear the same type of thing from you, Dr. Cuello, with your students. It's like that, they bring that kind of energy. And so it kind of keeps you on your toes and keeps you in that creative process.
Absolutely, right. Right.
And they keep you on your toes, I'm sure, don't they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And that's,
Because, yeah.
I'm just going to say that that's one thing that I know you and I talked about before with some of the work we've done together, Dr. Cuello, how if you're able to get that sort of pipeline of, you know, like new students every single year, bringing in those new ideas, they're not all going to be perfect, but if you get that kind of pipeline going, that's how you're going to generate the ideas that are going to be lasting, because you're always
Yes.
bringing in that new perspective, and that's what matters.
Absolutely, absolutely, right, yeah. And of course, I've got some advice that I give to my students so that they could cultivate that mindset, that faculty of inventiveness and creativity and innovation. One is to encourage them to expose themselves, for instance, to as many disciplines that they can afford to expose themselves. So even if somebody is, say, in business, one should not inhibit oneself from being exposed to, say, science or engineering, or even the arts and the literature. Because all of these disciplines are sources of, shall we say, inspiration, or a language for innovation and creativity. You get to learn the habits of mind of the people in these particular fields, and it's important to acquire those, and maybe even to understand them, because they could lead you to an innovative way, a creative way of approaching a particular challenge or problem that could lead to a novel solution.
I love
So,
hearing that because, I went through the school of thought of memorize the formulas or write them on as small as you can on a 3x5 card to use them on a test, and,
yes.
and then move on to the next chapter of the book, if you will. And, it wasn't until actually I went to Naval Postgraduate that I got into this is how you learn, and that was 10 plus 15 years after I graduated my undergraduate, and I actually started to learn how to learn. I'm really glad to hear that your curriculum focus has moved in, has adopted that same philosophy of it's not just about the formulas that exist today. It's about what formulas can you create for tomorrow, and what solutions can you create for tomorrow. And you don't come up with those if you're just memorizing so that you can pass the test.
Yes.
got to figure out different ways of looking at it and different ways of thinking and seeing.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah. And in my case, I guess I consider myself blessed because I grew up in a different country. And now I'm here in the U.S. I've been here now 31 years, and in my work, I've had a privilege as well of being able to travel around the world because of my research and teaching collaborations, and that continual exposure to different countries, you know, with different cultures, with different habits of thinking, with different approaches of working on things, and even different ways of looking at the world. That's been enormously beneficial to me in terms of being able to look at matters from different perspectives. And that really proved to be very helpful in coming up with an innovative solution.
Well, I've got something I want to tie that to. We might actually have something novel in itself here if this goes the right direction off my comment. But so something I've read before when they talk about studies of creativity is that most innovative and like groundbreaking ideas, they come when somebody is either young or young in their field. The classic example are all the different musicians. You know, Bob Dylan wrote like a Rolling Stone when he was 19 or 20, I think. And you always have these classic examples of the young, when they're young, they have this huge moment and they're still great. You know, Bob Dylan still wrote a lot of great songs later in life, but nothing ever hit that peak. And you see that with a lot of artists where they either paint their best painting when they're 18 years old, or they are always building up to their best painting. And those are the two different types of creativity. And when you talk about being young in your field, and then you compare that to what you're saying here about going in and learning other fields, I think that's where I'm really getting excited about this, because it's almost like you can bring that inspiration, you can bring that innovation by connecting to other fields that you're not aware of yourself.
Okay. Um, yes, Camden, I in a way I agree with you, but in a way I kind of disagree as well. in
I'd
terms
love to hear it.
in terms of the ability to innovate and to be
Mhm.
creative being related to one's youth. Uh,
So youth in the field is the way I put it, because you can be
right.
new in something else and see it a different way is the general idea behind it.
Yes, I think that's generally true, but even that, I kind of want to question that because, like for example, in my case, I've been in my field now for almost 30 years,
Hmm.
and I've been inventing only really for the past 10 years or so. And I feel like I'm in the most creative phase in my career. And I'm talking specifically about vertical farming and
Hmm.
also bioreactor design, because those are the two fields where I've been having, you know, a number of inventions now. Bioreactors, I've been working on it since grad school, so that's about 30 years now. And again, it's only been in the last 10 years where I come up with these really innovative and original designs and configurations of these bioreactors that we've disclosed, and the university is applying for patents. And so far, we've gotten 2 patents issued by the U.S. Patent Office, and others are pending as well. And I think in part because this is a type of innovation that requires deeper understanding.
Right.
Uh, for instance, in regard to bioreactors, one really has to understand very very well the process involved.
Hmm.
So in my case, that's what happened. And so because I had a deep understanding now of what bioreactor is about and what makes it tick, then I come up with this different configurations and designs where the essential process for it really is improved and is maximized. Now, in terms of creativity in the arts, like in songwriting,
Right.
perhaps, I think what you related is generally true.
I,
Uh,
if I could, so kind of, I think I misworded it slightly in a sense of there can be the explosive creativity that we're
right,
talking about, like with some people, but then there's also the incremental creativity. So there's plenty of other people, and if I was more into arts, I would be able to cite a lot of people for this, I'm sure. But it's
right.
where, you know, so I think Da Vinci would be an example of, if
Yep.
you go and you look at the underlayers of his painting with all the great technology we have now, is he drew that painting 200 times. And
right.
that's kind of the incremental creativity. So I 100% agree with what you're saying there, how you have to have this fundamental knowledge to be always building yourself up forward. Definitely.
Right, right. And in terms of age, and I would like to kind of emphasize this, I believe that one can be creative and innovative at any age.
Mm.
Youth always helps because you've got more energy when one is younger. But even, when you get older, when you become more mature, when you get older, what you gain is a deeper perspective and a
Right.
broader perspective of things. And that certainly does not exclude you from being innovative, but in fact, it gives you more qualification, greater qualifications for being innovative.
So do you think that in any ways you're what you were talking about as far as expanding into other fields, traveling, kind of expanding on your perspective, do you think that could, for lack of a better way to put it, be the solution to that? If, instead of being young in your field, if you stay in your field, but you're pulling stuff from other fields, you can kind of keep that in, kind of keep that going and keep that that creativity and inspiration going on a longer term.
Absolutely. That's what I refer to as sustained innovation.
And
So
it's back to sustainability. There we go. Full
exactly.
circle.
Well,
So remaining in one field of study doesn't mean that over time you're going to become necessarily stale. You can sustain your innovative sparks so long as you feed it, and the way you feed it is you gain greater understanding, deeper understanding, greater perspective by, as you mentioned, by traveling. But I would just make that equivalent to having a view of what the other disciplines have to offer and extracting, those valuable things from those other disciplines and then transporting them into your own field.
I think it comes back to something I coach my clients around, and it's that energy level. You
All right.
kind of touched on it. The young mind. We used to joke about they haven't had their souls crushed, so they're still optimistic about what the world will be like. Right? They're free thinking because they haven't been told what a stupid idea that is. But that's all tongue in cheek stuff. And the reality of it is, if you set your mind and you accept you accept things, and when you have less judgment, then your innovation, your internal intuition really
Right.
kicks in, because now you're not judging what other people may see or think or act, but you're not judging what you have in your head, and that idea that pops into your head when so and so's talking, you're sitting in class, whatever it is, and this idea pops into your head. If you're at a high anabolic energy level, you're like, man, you write that down and you start to pursue it.
Right, right. Otis, I absolutely agree with you. I think in general, people tend to become set in their mind and thinking as they age. But if one retains one's sense of childlike wonder, even as one ages physically, you get to retain your spark for innovation. So the key is to retain that capacity to have that sense of wonder at the world, at all the phenomena that are happening around us. And that relentless curiosity is also very important as well. And to be open-minded and not to be judgmental and cynical. Because the moment you become judgmental and cynical, to me, that's the end of innovation, practically.
It is, and that looking at things with wonder and just, how could I do that better? And it's not just in that. Another thing I talk about is continuous performance improvement. It's not just about that, but it's
right.
The next step of, how could I make it better? Not how can I do it better, but how can I make it better? And
right. Yeah.
Of things. I think that is when you start to get into the real innovation of what's the next thing.
Yes.
And that's where we get some fun stuff coming out, and and I go back to those folks who presented last night, and I tell you, there was only one or two that I would consider young. The rest of them were
Mhm.
we're generally speaking above 40, if not, above 50. The people who presented, the CEOs,
Right.
co-founders that presented last night at Techstars. So, yeah, I mean, it's about how you think and that necessity. Everything from one of them was her dad. She grew up on a ranch, and her dad's having trouble keeping track of how much water he uses and getting penalized. How to do that?
Mhm.
Toxic algae and preventing toxic algae in our water systems. So, uh, yeah,
That's wonderful.
I think as we're talking about this, the defining factor is your perspective, the way the frame in which you view the situation. And the way I'd like to put that is, if the goal is to always think outside the box, right? We're sitting here, we're looking at the problem, we're thinking outside the box. The best way, we're talking about kids and youth. If you don't know where the box is, it's really easy to think outside the box, right? But the
Right.
difference is, if you're already there and you've been working inside that box for years, then you have to make that conscious effort to be creative, to be innovative, and to break yourself outside of that framework you're built in.
Right, yes. So there's this German philosopher, I can't remember his name, but I remember him making that statement that talent is being able to hit a target that no one else can hit,
mm,
whereas genius is the ability to hit a target that no one else can see.
Mm. That's great.
yeah, that's
So
that's that mindset of creation right there. Yeah.
right. So I'm making the here and equivalence between genius and creativity. Uh, and all of us, when we hear the word genius, that sounds so intimidating. And when we call somebody a genius, we have this concept that he must be a really special person. Or he's touched by the divine.
Mhm.
But I think we have to make that more practical. So genius really is being able to create, being able to innovate, being able to create value, and so it's more approachable and more relatable. And I think that everybody really has that innate capacity.
Mhm.
Only if one is allowed to have that, by being in the proper nurturing environment, as well as being connected again to a certain grand challenge.
Right. Like, I'd say creativity, like many other things that we think of as, God-given abilities, it's a skill, and you can work on it and you can get better at it, just like anything else.
Right.
Well, this has been great, Joel, and I want to just honor your time, and I really appreciate you carving out time for us this morning. I know what are we like in midterm season right about now or so with
Oh, we're past midterm now.
okay, so we're on the downslope of the semester, right?
Well, except yeah, so to speak, but it's getting busier and busier toward the
Never really slows down.
Yeah, I'll throw something at you. A good friend of mine threw at me a couple of weeks ago. It is you're having full and rich days. You're not busy, but they're full and rich. And if you think
end.
like that, it's like, yeah, all right, man. I had a great day because I was, man, all these things going on are great things to have going on.
It's a real privilege, and I'm very grateful for it.
Well, hey, we always wrap up our show with what'd you learn? So I'm going to throw it at Camden first. Cam?
Oh, I learned that I need to flip my creativity philosophy a little bit away from the young and the young in the field a little bit more to the maturity, which you completely sold me on that. That's I follow on that now, and just looking at how you can build creativity over time if you're just working on your perspective in that sense.
And I'll go next. Japan in the vertical farming. I'm fascinated by that, and it is one of those. What at this point in life, a lot of my what did I learn aren't really just these huge watershed things. It's like, wow, that makes sense. How come I didn't know that? But for Japan really coming up with that solution of
Mhm.
vertical farming makes perfect sense on such a huge population to feed and really not a whole lot of land mass to do it with.
Mhm.
So
Right.
Joel, what over you?
Yeah. Well, I'm just constantly inspired by this. this idea that everybody has this innate ability to create. Not to be religious, as you know, in the Bible, it says that man was made in the image of the Creator, and the Creator has that ability to create. And so, if we were made in His image, then therefore we have that innate ability to create. But setting that aside, I think science has proven that really every child, every infant even, has that innate ability to relate to its surrounding world, its surrounding environment. And the way it does that is in part by being creative and by being innovative. So we have that talent, we have that ability, and throughout our life, we can actually develop that continuously. So talking about continuous improvement, it's continuous development of our spark of innovation and creativity. So being alive, being human is a wonderful thing.
That's awesome.
Oh, I love that.
Love it. Well, thank you again very much for taking time out of your busy schedule and sharing your thoughts with us and a bit of your story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, always, and thank you very much, Camden. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be on your show.
Thank you for being here.